everyone, welcome back to But Why the Podcast, and today we are covering Japan's master of horror, Junji Ito. As always, I'm Kate, and I'm here with Adrian.
Hey, how's it going?
And Matt.
Hello.
And we have a special guest to help me talk about all the spookiness, Cidnya.
Hello!
Hi.
So
Spooky time.
These are the episodes where I thrive.
Yeah, me too. I usually do pretty well on these episodes, I think. I think I kill it.
I was going to put some images
I try to
in.
ask great questions.
I was going to...
Oh, no, please don't.
I didn't. I was going to put some images in, but then I remembered how you respond to my Junji Ito t-shirts, and I was like, no, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
So, Cidnya, why don't you tell us why, I guess, so usually we ask guests, why you're on here. Why are you on here?
Well, you asked me to, but also I love horror, and with that comes a very strong love for Junji Ito, because he was one of the founding creators that really got me to love horror so much. I read Uzumaki for the first time my freshman year of high school, and I've been in love with his work ever since.
That is amazing, and that goes straight into our first question to start off the pod, is what's your favorite Junji Ito story?
It depends on my mood. I consistently go between Uzumaki and Tomi, because sometimes I love killer beauty queens, and sometimes I just reminisce and have that nostalgia for the first time I read Uzumaki. So it kind of depends, but I always jump between the two of those.
Awesome. And for Adrian and Matt, what's your favorite Junji Ito story? Or what do you know about him?
Go for it, Matt.
Okay, I'll go first. One, you all know why I'm here. At this point, I don't know who we're talking about, what we're talking about, or anything we're talking about. I'm just here so I don't get fined.
As with any anime manga episode. Adrian?
Man, I already forgot the name of the one that you guys just said. I was just going to say that one to be coy, but I totally forgot what the name of it was. I was going to say JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
Yeah.
No, I really have. I mean, it's been 3 years. I don't do horror stuff, let alone read horror stuff. The only thing I really know about this is that Kate has very scary shirts that I saw the last convention that we went to, and I can see why this is her thing, because those shirts are very disturbing, and I'm sure this stuff is disturbing, and I'm sure it's right up her alley, but literally the opposite direction of mine, the complete opposite direction.
Well, my favorite story is, I was going to say Tomi, but my favorite one we're going to talk about a little later is actually the man in the chair, or the human chair. The human chair.
Interesting.
And it's just because it capitalizes on one of my biggest fears. And we'll talk about that towards the end of the episode when we get into a lot of Junji Ito's themes. But
until we get there, I'm just gonna think that you're scared of chairs for this entire episode.
When we get there,
and every time I see a chair in a game we play together, or whenever you post a chair in your Animal Crossing thing, I'm just gonna think of how you're scared of chairs until otherwise.
I'm sorry to say this, Adrian, but when we get there, you're gonna be scared of all your chairs at home.
That's really funny.
Here we go.
But yeah, as a shock to no one, I'm leading this episode because horror is my jam, but more specifically, horror manga and manga in general is something that is a very unique storytelling format. I don't even really like comparing it to American comics because they're fairly different. And Junji Ito was one of the first horror. I think like you, Cidnya, I think he was actually the first horror manga I ever read, and it really got me into body horror and stuff. But for those of you who haven't picked up on it, Junji Ito is a Japanese horror mangaka. If you don't know what a mangaka is, it's okay. It is a term used to describe a manga creator. Usually the term is for people who both write and illustrate work, but now as manga is kind of moving towards a format of having multiple people on a title, so more like traditional American comics. It's kind of just used if you're involved in manga making. And Junji Ito was born in July of 1963 in Sakashita, now part of Nakatsugawa, Gifu. He began his experience in the horror world at a very young age because his two older sisters would read Kazuo Umezu and Shinichi Koga manga. And if you don't know who those guys are, they are some of the horror big hitters before Junji Ito comes on the scene. So they're kind of like the old masters, I guess would be the easiest thing. But this is a kind of really, I feel like every time we discuss a horror person, it's always somebody who read this as a kid and then just developed into this like horror icon, like Guillermo del Toro reading monster magazines and idolizing Universal Monsters when he was younger. And ultimately, what also helps shape him and his ideas of horror is the fact that he grew up on a countryside in a small city next to Nagano, and in his house, where the bathroom was, it was essentially at the end of an underground tunnel, and there were spiders and crickets, and essentially he uses this experience in a lot of his work, a lot of claustrophobia, a lot of isolation, and a lot of weird bug things.
Mm-hmm. Very disgusting creatures.
Sometimes just bug legs on another animal. It's nightmare fuel. Ito first began writing and drawing manga as a hobby while he was a dental technician in 1984, but in 1987 he submitted a short story in Gekkan Halloween, which is also Monthly Halloween. It was a Japanese monthly magazine of shoujo that was published between 86 and 95. Easiest way to reference it is Shonen Jump. It's kind of like that, but spooky. That story won an honorable mention in the Kazuo Umezu Prize, with Umezu himself being one of the judges, which is one of those like, oh wow, this man is my icon, and now he loves my story moments, which led it to be serialized as Tomi, which has been adapted into live action film series with 8 installments to date, as well as an anthology TV series which was released in 1999. Tomi is a series of stories about a young woman who defies death and aging over and over again by essentially luring men and pulling them down into madness in order to fuel her own rebirth and immortality.
So just like a normal... No, I'm just kidding.
Oh my god.
No. Just kidding, Twitter. I'm just kidding. It's a joke. I gotta contribute somehow, okay? This is...
I mean, I bet you Stefani's listening to this, so you'd have to explain that joke to her.
No, it's okay.
I mean, you've met my wife. This is...
You can respond to...
That's all I'm gonna say. That's all I'm gonna say.
You can respond to Viz Media's tweet about if you're thinking about her.
Oh gosh, yeah. Viz Media, who now has the publishing rights to Junji's work in the States in English, they kill it on social media when it comes to posting his stuff. Mm-hmm. They just released an art volume, and so it's been a lot of it. But specifically looking at Tomi, which was his first and kind of quintessential, I guess, like story that he's done. Cidnya, why is it something that, you kind of listed as one of your favorites?
I think I grew up in that time where Jennifer's Body came out, so it was like the idea of like prom queen or like pretty girls kind of like killing men seemed really interesting to me when I was like 15 or 16. And so when I read Tomi when I was around 16 or 17, and it was that same kind of concept, but just more glorified, obviously way better written. I kind of just loved the idea of people being driven insane by beauty, because I think in a world where like vanity is so apparent, I think it's a fun little like not only is it poking fun at that concept, but also it's terrifying. Like, Tomi's kind of actually super gross and disgusting. And people see it and they still love her for it because she's just that powerful. I just think it's fun.
And that's one of the things that I also want to talk about too as we move into our first but why though, which is how Ito has shaped horror, is really using some of these ideas of the feminine in a lot of his work. Like, I would say the vast majority of his work features a female protagonist. But in order to kind of get how he's shaped horror, we also have to look where he's come from and the people who've inspired him. So in addition to Kazuma Mezo, Ito also cites Hideshi Hino, Shinichi Koga, and Yasutaka Tsutsi and H.P. Lovecraft as the major influences in his work. H.P. Lovecraft specifically because if you don't know, H.P. Lovecraft is kind of one of the pioneers of cosmic horror, so kind of like these ancient gods hovering in the background that are just waiting to rip the world apart and come in from the seams. So a lot of the times, not a lot of the times, but in some of his writing, you see a lot of like these eldritch god inspired entities in power and scale. And it really comes across while also maintaining like a really distinct uniqueness. Most of the time, the universe that Ito depicts is cruel and capricious. His characters often find themselves victims of a malevolent, unnatural circumstances for no discernible reason, or punished out of proportion for minor infractions against an unknown or incomprehensible natural order. I like this last part specifically because there are elements of his work that reminds me of a lot of like Mexican like folk tales. A lot of the time, like a demon or like a ghost lady will come after you for doing something ridiculously small and stupid.
I didn't know that.
And that happens a lot in Ito stories. Some of the recurring themes in Ito's work include jealousy, envy, body horror, and seemingly ordinary characters who begin to act out of irrational compulsions, the breakdown of society, deep sea life, and the inevitability of one's demise, all displayed in realistic and simple design, which helps contrast the ultimate beauty and death that you see in his work. So you have when his work starts, you have things that are extremely mundane, things that are pretty, things that are normal, and as his stories continue, they warp further and further and further into the grotesque and into things that are just I don't want to say weird, but nightmare fuel. Nightmare fuel is the best word.
Yeah, Uzumaki follows that structure very well, as, considering that that's one of his most accessible works.
And why do you think it's one of his most accessible ones?
I don't know, actually. I've never really thought about that. All I know is that, like, in my high school library, like, they only had Tomi and Uzumaki, and when I go to bookstores, it's, like, the only two I can ever really find. Occasionally. You start to see more Junji Ito work, but I think everyone loves stories about, small towns that kind of go awry. Like, it's a very popular trope, and I think he did that one very well, which is why I think they've always kept it in publication since it originally came out.
And I think you're right that that's a really good kind of example, because you start with a small town and then you end up with a spiral death fest.
Yes, and it's horrifying and gross.
And I really do encourage people to just kind of look up a lot of his illustrations, because there is a beauty behind them. Like, they're grotesque and they're weird and they're scary, but they're always tethered to some piece of like elegance to it. Like, it's not just ugly to be ugly, which I think is something that you can be really heavy-handed with in horror. It's the reason why a lot of like gory movies or even just body horror movies in general can take it so far left that you lose remnant pieces of beauty. And he does it really, really well, and he does it consistently throughout all of his publishing. So one of the things that I found really interesting is that Tomi was actually inspired by the death of one of his classmates. He felt strange that a boy he knew suddenly disappeared from the world and expected him to show up again. And that's how he came up with the idea of a girl who was supposed to have died, but then shows up as if nothing had happened. Gyo, Gyo, I forget, I'm not sure how it's pronounced because I've never said it out loud, is also another one of his famous works, and it was influenced by his anti-war feelings that he developed when he was a child due to his parents' war stories. And then you also have the Hanging Balloons, which is based on a childhood dream. So he pulls from all of these real-life pieces to construct a horror and construct horror storytelling that, yes, deals with things on a cosmic scale and deals with grand kind of narratives, but is also really grounded in the things that are human. And I think that that's something that sets him apart, but also pushes a lot of other horror manga to start hitting those beats as they start coming out.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Oh, no, I was going to say that I think that's another reason I really, really love his particular brand of horror is because I feel like I've had some of the nightmares that he's had. And like when I read interviews with him where he was just like, oh yeah, I was just thinking about how weird that would be. And it's like so clear that he has the strangest intrusive thoughts. And sometimes I'm just sitting and I'm like, what if there are like giant spiders in my bathroom? And like, sure enough, like you could probably find pages of a Junji Ito work where they're just like spiders just everywhere. And it just kind of gets under your skin while also being so appealing because the artwork always looks beautiful and very masterfully done that it's just like, this is terrifying because I feel like this could happen and I don't like that.
And I mean, and it reminds me of, there's another one of his stories, and I can't remember the name. I think it's called Grease. But it was inspired by the fact that while he was in school to be a dental technician, in his dorm, he was expected to sleep on a mattress that had turned brown from the sweat of people before him. And like sweat and grease and all that causes pimples. And so essentially what he did was he wrote a story about a family that lives above their restaurant, and the oil and the aroma from the restaurant would essentially came up through the floorboards and through, just rows and covered the entire house and everything in grease. And you have these siblings with a very volatile relationship who essentially, I don't want to give it away, but it all leads to them developing pimples, which then there's a panel where all those kind of get pushed out. And it's crazy. And Ew. It is literally just all stems from he was like, oh, this is a really gross mattress. And if I get a pimple from this is going to be awful. And he wrote a story about it, which I think also really there's a sentiment in what he does that really uses the mundane, so the everyday pieces of life, and twists them in a way that makes them recognizable but also makes them interesting. And I think that the reason he's able to do that is in our next But Why Though, which is specifically he likes to play by the rules. So when we look at horror greats, a lot of the time we're talking about how they're innovating and how they're subverting the genre into something new and actively doing that. But that's not Ito's goal, and he's talked about it a lot. Which is interesting because he's impacted horror manga and horror storytelling. So Ito has impacted horror storytelling even in the West. He's friends with Guillermo del Toro, so that should tell you something. And he's done that by respecting the laws of horror, which he sees as vital to his work, specifically when he talks about himself as a master of horror. He says that he's an inheritor rather than an innovator of horror manga. So whereas some people see themselves as a trailblazer, he sees him as just continuing to contributing to an existing great legacy and not rewriting it. One of the ways that this is specifically shown in his work is how he depicts women in his stories, because in the West and really in horror overall, whether you're watching J horror, K horror, American horror, even European horror, you have this idea of beauty and innocence and purity, specifically of female characters, that is replicated in the genre. And this is something that you find a lot of in Junji Ito's work. And it's been a pain point for some people, like it has been for the genre at large. Especially because often these themes that often see women dealing with really violent things can also dip into eroticism. But for me specifically, I see it as how he breaks down a feminine ideal and he warps it in a way that makes it terrifying, visceral, and cathartic at the same time. And he plays with ideas of purity and innocence, but he also uses that to tell a broader, I guess, bring out a broader narrative. So there's one story called The Fashion Model, and it has a panel that circulates all the time. And essentially she's this really grotesque woman who somehow became a model, and a film director decides to cast her as the lead, and they go into the forest to shoot, and they end up just realizing, oh, she's more monster than supermodel, than fashion model. And it's a giant look at how people perceive beauty and also how people are measured by beauty, and it kind of causes you to cast doubt on how you see things. And so he uses these concepts in a very traditional way, but he also uses them in a way that allows the story to tap into things that we're dealing with. And I also think Tomi is a really great example of using beauty and the feminine to tell a larger story, kind of like how you mentioned, Cidnya, at the beginning.
Yeah, I do know that there are criticisms where people don't like, I don't know, like inherently like idealizations of women in horror, and they often cite that like Junji Ito is a proprietor of that. But oftentimes the stories that I have read, because I haven't read everything of his just because there's not necessarily a large amount of his stuff in publication in America. Still, there's a lot of his short stories that just haven't been like translated or published. But when I read Tomi, or when I read like The Hanging Balloons or even Uzumaki, I never feel as if the female protagonists are there to be eye candy in the sense that like that's all they exist for. Like he is always thinking about symbolism and tapping into critiques of society and how people view not only girls but like whatever they're dealing with and stuff like that. And just like one of my favorite like horror protagonists is I think her name is pronounced Kairi in Uzumaki, because she is beautiful, but also she's smart, and she's like, hey, there's something wrong with the town that I live in. What is going on? And she's brave and she's courageous, and she'll do whatever she can to like help her friends and her boyfriend. And even though she is going a bit stir crazy in this like small town where everything is going awry, I never feel like she's being objectified or like lowered as a person because she's a woman, even if there is that sense of idealization within Junji's art for her. And also, Junji doesn't, I guess like the best way to phrase this, like Junji isn't afraid to show women as monsters alongside their beauty. So like Tomi is great because it's like Tomi is beautiful and she's radiant and she's eternal, but there are people that view her as like this grotesque looking monster, like that famous picture of her with like her second head coming out.
Oh, yeah.
And it comes from like a guy was painting her, and he's like, oh yes, I finally captured your true beauty. And she gets so mad because she's like, I don't look like that, I'm not a monster, how dare you. And he's like, no, but you're so beautiful. And I think it's just a very interesting idea to toy with the how you view yourself isn't necessarily the right way that you are, I guess is the best way to say it.
Yeah, I think too, like what you touched on is really it's how do you explain it? It's the discourse that horror in the US has gone through, because you have immediately when the slashers rise, you have a lot of people critiquing the final girl and the idea of a final girl, and not without merit. Like there are issues to it, but then in the mid 2000s, and now we're having a revival of final girls being defined by our generation in a very different way. It kind of shows you that like there isn't anything wrong with the trope per se, it's how people use it. And so I think sometimes when somebody reads a synopsis of something or just looks at art, it's really easy to dismiss it as buying into the trope fully, as opposed to allowing somebody the breathing room to use that trope and to do more with it, if that makes sense. Because that's something that is always at the forefront of discussing horror, is how horror treats women. Because when you look at horror film in the US, horror film is I think it's the most female-driven stories, with the least female-driven, or the least female-directed directors and writers at the helm of them. And so that's also been a critique of looking at women in anime and manga. And so it's kind of akin to, and I don't really know too much about like the broader horror scene as it pertains to manga outside of Junji. And so it would be interesting to see like how that kind of corresponds. But I personally really like his work, and I've never really seen some of the sharper criticisms of it. I often kind of, which not saying they're not valid, but I'm just kind of like, I don't know if we read the same thing, kind of.
Yeah, no, that's very similar to how I feel whenever I see people say that. I'm like, did you read it?
Yeah.
Which I guess sounds kind of mean, but I don't know. I feel like maybe there is the sentiment that like manga, and I see this often, like manga isn't to be looked at critically, but I feel like if you are to look at any manga critically and really just think about it outside of the fact that it is illustration and word bubbles, like Junji Ito packs a lot of stuff into either his short stories or just general, serials.
Oh yeah, 100%. And all of that reps into how he's really become a master of horror, because when we say master of horror, we think of literature like Stephen King, or you think about film like John Carpenter, but Ito is a master not despite being a mangaka, but because he is a mangaka, because he does create manga, because it gives him a unique view in the horror world, because he writes stories that are short and long. He draws them and he creates surreal, otherworldly worlds and ideas. And there's also immense use of body horror. And when we talked about Stephen King being a master of horror, one of the things that we brought up was the fact that he's adapted endlessly, because his horror is accessible, but also because his horror has a lasting power. And in the same vein, Ito's very first series, Tomi, has been adapted into 8 Japanese films, which were a series that ran from 1999 to 2011, and they also end up being able to recreate the manga's atmosphere and really be held kind of loved. He also has an anime based on his work. It's an anthology called the Junji Ito Collection, and 2 episodes of that are adapted from Tomi alone. There are, I think, I looked it up, they're pretty much a live action adaptation for almost all of his stuff. But I couldn't get a concise number. And then there are also varying animated adaptations as well. And in 2019, Alexandre Aja, who did The Hills Have Eyes and High Tension, and most recently Crawl, was announced to be developing a web series for Quibi called Of Tomi, in conjunction with Sony Pictures Television and Universal, with David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick serving as writer and executive producer, with Hiroki Shirota as the co-producer on the series. So it's still like that one story is still being used today as being adapted. Which I think speaks to its power, but also Junji's staying power as a creator.
Did you know about the Toonami adaptation for Uzumaki that's going to happen. They
Yes.
released a trailer for it, and it was absolutely stunning.
I have not seen the trailer, so I have it. I don't forgot where I put it, but I did put it in here that they're gonna be putting it on Adult Swim, which I forgot is Toonami now because it happens at night, which is weird. I can't wrap my brain around Toonami happening at night. It's weird for me. But yeah, it's going to be amazing, and it's going to be accessible to an American audience, which, like you said, a lot of his work is still just in the Japanese. And Viz got the rights in 2016, so they've been putting out more stuff. I think they translated Shiver, which is one of the collections, and I think they have more coming out as well.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Because I know, Sid, you said you had it in your library, which blows my mind. We did not have these kind of books in our library. We had like Dragon Ball Volume 1 for our manga selection. Like that was it. But like listening to this, it sounds a lot like when we talked about, not the exact same because it's obviously not the same, right? It's different kind of medium of storytelling, but it sounds a lot like when we covered Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark with some of the things, obviously not quite as visual, right? Just because that's not how like the book was written. But is it just purely because it's coming from a Japanese market and that's why it's not as popular here? Because I feel like all of my friends would have loved this just as much as they loved, probably younger, but probably like Goosebumps and then older Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Is it just that, or is it just newer? So it's like having a like resurgence here kind of thing. Like, why isn't it bigger here is like my big question. Is it just because it's Japanese?
I would say yes. So how do I explain it? So for me, I've always known about it in the horror circles that I've been in. So like horror fans know who Junji Ito is, even if it's just because they have prints of his panels. And they've read Tomei and maybe Uzumaki. Like those are probably the two that I would say most horror fans who do things outside film have read. But I think to your point of it not being like Scary Stories or just being everywhere, I think it is because it's taken so long to translate and because it's a mature title. Like it's the fact that it's going through two barriers. Like when you look at a lot of anime or manga that gets translated very easily, it's the shonen titles or even the shoujo titles that are aimed at that smaller or that younger audience because it's broader and more marketable. But then when you shift that over to a higher age bracket, you end up closing your available market to go to it. So I think a lot of it was not necessarily a priority. There was not a resurgence, but there was a small shift in publishing, I believe, when J-horror kicked off in the US. So The Ring, The Grudge, Audition, when those started hitting the rounds, you saw an uptick in kind of people who knew him, but he's been around since the 80s, and I think it's just now kind of hitting US mainstream because it's from Japan in a way that is kind of gated by multiple things. It's mature content, it's horror content, and it's not necessarily coming from a large serialized magazine, which are kind of all the factors that allow all of the shonen series to air on Toonami and simuldub.
Yeah, no,
Currently.
I completely agree.
So,
oh no, you go. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, like, just given that, like, do you think that it's gonna happen? Like, do you have faith that like this is going to get back? Because not that like a 2019 like web series isn't a cool thing, right? But that's not as big as like Del Toro saying, "Hey, I'm going to adapt this thing into a movie."
Which I was going to ask, why don't we have a lot of movies then?
Yeah.
Well,
because if it's big in horror circles, right? You would think that like horror people will be like, "Hey, Junji Ito, like let's make a movie of your stuff." Because I think Americans love horror stuff, right?
horror.
Do we like horror?
Yes, but
horror people in America like horror.
But horror fans,
is that a better way to say that?
Also don't like American adaptations of other people's things.
What if like Del Toro did it?
Because it's very different. So horror is specifically driven by fears, and those fears are usually coming from the culture that the horror is created from. So like our exorcism stories look very different than exorcism stories in Korean films, for example, because we have different fears. And so when you adapt it, you end up losing some of that in translation because you're pulling it over into a new culture, hoping that the fears translate, but then also making those fears translate by changing elements of it. I think
you're right. I don't have that. I don't understand that fear of chairs just yet.
Oh, you will.
Maybe it's just a cultural thing.
Well,
But no, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Like,
So it's
that adaptation wise, I can see that.
yeah, but there are a lot of films.
They get like the guy.
Like,
they get like the guy. Right?
You know what?
Like,
I think
does really good adaptations.
I think Tomy could really succeed in the U.S. I think if they did which they're doing on Kiwi, but if they did a movie of it, I think it would work for the U.S.
I think it would. I think the world is ready. I think I would like it. I would like it very much.
Okay, let's not go movie. What about like I mean, they has series, right, and
Yeah.
anthologies. Like, would you rather see it in a movie form or like a Netflix series where you can get more of it?
I would be down with a Netflix series. And actually, I would be down with a Netflix series because Netflix series that are coming from other countries and they're still getting circulated and hitting those high watch rates on Netflix now. You see it happening with Korean dramas and stuff. I think even moving it to a platform like Shudder would be really, really cool.
There you go,
I'd
Netflix.
be
If
down
you're
with
listening, I know you are. You have your
Yeah.
executive producers right here, me and Matt.
Yeah. I also think that something that really doesn't help Junji Ito's works get adapted like on the Western end is because when you translate it to film, there's a lot of like rating checks that are
Yeah.
going to happen, and so a lot of his work is like suggested mature, but like for particular, one of my absolute favorite pieces of his is called like The Hanged Balloons, and a lot of people are like either decapitated or hung because like the faces of dead people are on balloons that have a noose on the bottom that like follow you until you inevitably like die as well. And saying that is horrifying, it's terrifying, but like I feel like that like showing that on film would be very difficult to get it into like a theater or even like a mainstream like audience, just because it's such a like niche little like horror thing that most people are going to be like disgusted and repulsed by like the actual premise. And I feel like a lot of his works are like kind of all a little weird, a little niche, because he derives a lot of his horror from like personal anxieties that he has or like personal traumas. So I don't know, I also feel it's like that where it's like how do you get this to be marketable and like not shun like almost everyone out?
Yeah, because I think like when you look at like horror that does well in theater, like we're seeing things like Get Out, hit Hereditary, Midsummer, and these are things that are more grounded in reality, which makes sense, and I love them. But when you look at Junji Ito, a lot of it is really out there. Like one of his stories, Jayo, you have essentially, Matt, you'll like this, sea creatures decide that they're going to take over the world, and so they start coming up from the ocean, but they have like mechanical insect legs.
It's disgusting.
That doesn't translate that well for film. So it gets a little hard. I think if there were more mass-produced anime on these things, like I think like a solid like 24 episode Tomy anime, I think that would hit. Like dubbed in English and stuff like that. Like I think Uzumaki, when that comes out, I think it's gonna be the big thing.
It's gonna be a game changer. I feel it. I know it.
Yeah.
It's gonna be so good.
Yeah. Because
Sorry, I didn't mean to get you off track. I was just really curious.
no,
and why we just
it's a really good part of the conversation. Like it because it is something that like I've kind of wondered. Because it is like I get to talk to it to like a random horror person on the internet every now and again, but like I don't get to have the giant conversations that I have about like Sailor Moon or My Hero Academia. I don't get to have those conversations about Junji Ito. And it's just because it's genre specific, but it's also very gated. I think you're right on the nose, Cidnya. Gated in censorship. Because it's a lot to translate and bring over. which a lot of people don't realize how restrictive a lot of America's publishing things are, because land of the free, but you can't really show a lot in different types of mediums. So, but I want a Tomy series now.
Yeah, I would love.
Really bad. I'd be really down for a Tomy series. And that one would also be easier to adapt because it's really focused on her versus a larger cosmic thing going on. Like, I think a Tomy live action could be done in the US fairly easily. Because we have those stories already about women, so it may be the easiest one to slot in for American audiences. But yeah, so another one of the Bitwithers is specifically how he does horror, and we've talked about it a little bit throughout this conversation, is that Ito's stories strike this balance between normal and horror, and his stories often begin in normality and then descend into madness of the supernatural, or the monstrous kind, and are usually never really resolved. And because there's really no solid, like, oh, this was a good thing, this was a bad thing, it leaves, like, a door open in your mind for that to just sit there and you just kind of spiral a little bit. I know I do when I read his stuff.
Yeah, I think a lot. Like, I usually have to be like, much to think about after I read anything of his.
And it's also the fact that Ito focuses on these mundane fears, like the ocean, being watched, claustrophobia. Like, those are some of his big ones, and they come up over and over again. And he's able to balance the build-up in the normal part of the story to really pay off with these explicitly grotesque illustrations. And for me, it's in my top 5 Junji Ito, but it's probably like my second or third, is The Long Dream, is a really, really good example of this. And so essentially in The Long Dream, while she awaits an operation in the hospital, a patient named Mommy claims she has seen the personification of death and it paid her a visit. Her doctor, Kuroda, thinks Mommy is scared of dying, but the figure she mistook for death was really another patient, Tetsuro Mukoda. Mukoda is a man in a hospital bed who lives years, sometimes entire lives, every time he sleeps. When he wakes up, the time he spent in the dream is worn on his skin, and his body slowly begins to degrade and morph into something that looks completely alien and frightening. There's nothing threatening in this story. Like, there's no monster or otherworldly creature, and it's really just this guy who ends up succumbing to, like, these eternal dream cycles, and you get to see his body just deteriorate into being this sunken and immobile, like, I don't even know how to explain it. It kind of just personifies the fears that we have around death and dying, and it really makes the reader confront these ideas of mortality and what happens to the body. In a very similar way to the Hearst song, Adrian, from Scary Stories, A Tale in the Dark. People don't want to think about what happens.
Yeah. I got you. Just, it's all right. Sorry, I'm going to go watch Barney or something after this. Fine, because I'm picturing that dude, how that dude looks, and I don't want to look it up. I'm, like, really tempted. I'm not going to lie. I looked up Tomy, and I regret it. I regretted it entirely. So.
Yeah. Additionally, another one of his strengths is the fact that he's really able to adapt other works into a manga format. And this is something that happens a lot, like a lot of mangaka, or a lot of, like, famous stories or larger works that are just literature will be adapted into a manga format. And so one of my favorite examples of this is also my favorite story, which is The Human Chair. In this, a writer goes into a furniture store one day, and the owner ends up telling her about another author named Yoshiki Tagawa. Tagawa regularly received letters from other authors looking for advice on their work. In one manuscript, a character hides inside the armchairs that he makes. The story unnerves Yoshiko because she fears that it's actually a confession, and she starts to think that somebody is inside the chair that her husband just bought. So it's really disturbing reimagining of Edogawa Rampo's story that has the same name. And the ending is different and a lot from the original. And specifically what happens is you just have her slowly realizing, and he does these cutaway panels where you can see the body of somebody in the chair and her sitting on top of it. And it's terrifying. And there's one panel where they open up the back of the chair and you just see this hollowed out spot for somebody to sit.
Yes, I see that picture circulate all the time, and I've never read that story, but every time I look at it, I'm just like, oh god, ew. Like, I don't want to know.
Yeah. Which, for me, like, every time I hear something in my house, I think that there is somebody living in our attic, and it scares me, and I don't like it. Like, it's just the idea... Because this one, like, there's nothing supernatural about it. Like, it's literally just this really ugly carpenter really, really just wants to be closer to this woman and crafts a chair to, like, live under her. Which is just absurd. And also, I don't, like, when you buy something from the swap meet, maybe open up the back first to make sure somebody's not in there.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean by, like, the fears that he writes about are, like, kind of weird and a little niche, and I feel like people who, like, don't have those, like types of anxieties are just kind of like, what the heck is this? I don't get it. Why, like, that's weird, but why is that scary? Whereas, like, someone like me or you, Kate, we're like, oh my god, like, every piece of furniture, I'm gonna have to cut a hole into it and make sure there's no one in it.
Yep. Because I had never, before I read this, I never, like, I've always thought, okay, well, somebody could live in the attic or something, but I had never thought of somebody living in a piece of furniture. Like, it's just, yeah. Questions, thoughts, concerns.
Yeah, I look at the thing. This one's not as scary as the other one. This one's fine. There's a 15-minute short drama about the human chair.
Yep.
Is it good?
I haven't watched it.
You have thoughts on that?
I have not watched it.
Are you not down?
No! So this is the thing. There it is, like, and like you said, like, the images from this one are not grotesque and terrifying. It's just the thought of having somebody being right by you and not knowing that that person is there is just terrifying to me. It's why home invasion horror movies scare me so much.
Yeah.
Dennis Quaid could have been in that chair.
Dennis Quaid. I was going to ask, is it Dennis Quaid in the chair? I love that. That's where your mind went. I'm all about that. If you're unfamiliar, Dennis Quaid is a home invasion movie, and he's very scary.
Real scary. Matt, any thoughts on the human chair?
Now I'm just picturing his face. His stupid smile that he has in that movie is coming through a chair. Oh, great. That's awesome.
I don't know why this is terrifying. It sounds ridiculous. I just don't see, like, who sits around and thinks somebody lives in my chair. You know how big a chair would have to be for somebody to live in it?
Yeah, it was drawn.
Hey,
it was a giant armchair.
There was that one episode of Always Sunny.
This is what I'm saying about, like, the anxieties of it, where it's like if you don't have that anxiety for whatever reason, like, I just think that people are gonna think it's just, like, ridiculous, and I think Matt just proved me right.
Yes, because Matt, you don't think somebody's living in our attic, right?
No,
exactly.
I like get so scared sometimes in my own house if I'm, like, by myself and I hear noises and I'm like, okay, is someone here? And then, like, I'll go in through all of my doors and I'll open up the rooms and I'm like, obviously no one's here, but, like, the thought still sits with me and I'm like, oh, but what if? Because I have anxiety and it never goes away and it sucks.
Yeah, it's a lot. Well, I'm sorry that it seems absurd to you, Matt, but the human chair is terrifying for me.
Hey, they put Danny DeVito in that couch in Always Sunny. it could happen, all right?
Yeah.
So when you also go through a lot of the things, two of the things that he's really known for are specifically his body horror, because when you look at the US, we see humans transforming almost completely into monsters and growing strange limbs. And this, the best example of this is Cronenberg's The Fly or The Thing, where you have human bodies morphing into something that is entirely no longer like, the process of transformation is not about maintaining human features, it's about completely losing. And for Ito, his work really focuses on leaving the human body recognizable in all of the things that he does. So he warps the human body into something different and brings that element of body horror into it while still maintaining the fact that it's human. There's a panel where it's somebody's neck and head stretched into a spiral, but it's very clearly still a head and neck. And it's weird, and I don't know how that man thinks of these things, but this is really recognizable, and it's one of the things that grounds his horror, because you're not watching some person being morphed into a monster. And then usually in a lot of Western horror, you have the person becomes a monster, and then that monster then breaks with all humanity, and you're just like, oh, okay, I don't feel bad for them anymore, let the movie wrap up. Whereas this, any time a body is manipulated to look like something else, it's very painfully still human and still brings that empathic link to you and that character.
Yeah, what comes to mind immediately, and I think about it, I actually just talked to my roommate about this recently because he just read Uzumaki not that long ago, is there is a chapter where Kyrie's at school, and there's like this really gross, like sweaty guy who like turns into like a snail. But as he transforms into a snail, like he keeps his like human body for most of it, and it's like genuinely disturbing. And I think about it a lot, and it gets under my skin because I don't like slimy looking human snails that are like fully grown adults, and it's just I don't know how he does it. Like. Yeah, it's like I don't know how he does it. I don't know why he thinks of these things, and like I love it because I can't look away because it's so gross. But at the same time, I'm like, I wish this wasn't in my thoughts at like 4 a.m. when I'm wide awake and I have nothing better to do.
And then you have his monsters, which like I mentioned Jayo, where it is essentially he pulls together different elements to just really make you just like, oh, this is not right. Specifically, like I mentioned, the sea-dwelling creatures emerging from the depths of the ocean to invade the land with insect mechanical legs. It's a lot. It's weird. And then when you look into his other work, last year Ito won an Eisner Award for his manga adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And then some of his most notable works outside of the ones that we've discussed today are the Enigma of Amagara Fault, which essentially there's a fault in the earth and you end up with human-shaped holes appearing in it. You have Tomi, which you've talked about, and then Jayo, and then you end up with some of his other works like Ito Junji Kyufu Manga Collection, and it's a collection of different short stories that include stories named Soichi's Journal of Delights and Junji Ito's Cat Diary, Yan and Moo. And this is adorable because it's really just a self-parody about him and his wife living in their house with their 2 cats. Which is where I really just bring up the fun fact that Junji Ito in person is the most unassuming. Like, the man doesn't look like he likes horror. He just looks like a nice a nice man. He did, what was it? Did he do the Dougie? Or he had an interview with Crunchyroll.
And he was doing the whip, and he was doing the nae-nae.
Yes, it was adorable. And like he was walking through the Winchester Mystery House doing this interview with Crunchy, and he was just like, my favorite band's the Beatles. And it was just like, he's not some dark gothic king like Stephen King. He's just an adorable man who has 2 cats and a kid, and he writes really terrifying things.
Yeah, he just looks like a like a cozy grandpa. Like I feel like I would expect him to like live in a cottage.
Pretty much. And the other thing too, we kind of mentioned it, like one of the reasons, and I think Adrian, to like your point about it picking up in the West, I mean the fact that it had an entire clothing line at Hot Topic that sold every single unit that it printed.
Yeah,
Like,
I was going to ask about that too. Was that a new line?
That was a new line.
That...
It came out in 2019, and it's gone now.
Yeah, gotcha. Because I wasn't sure. Cause I don't think I'd ever seen that. I mean, I haven't been in a Hot Topic in years.
Yeah.
But but I didn't know if that was like a new line or
not.
Yeah,
no.
Because I'd never seen you wear that stuff. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Completely new, and he partnered with Crunchyroll to do it. And once it was sold, and it did extremely well. And I think that alone, whether it was because people knew who he was or the people were like, oh, this is really cool looking, I think that those are ways for people to get involved. Then, as my fun fact, before we give our final thoughts, director and my favorite director, and who I have adopted as my tío, Guillermo del Toro, cited on his official Twitter account that Ito was originally a collaborator for the video game Silent Hills, which was supposed to be a sequel to Silent Hill, of which both Del Toro and Hideo Kojima were the main directors on. However, a year after the announcement, the project ended up being canceled by Konami. But Ito and Del Toro both have their likenesses in Kojima's Death Stranding. So if you play Death Stranding, you get to see a holographic Junji Ito.
I love that they're all friends. That makes me really happy.
Like,
I'm also...
if those are two people to be friends, or three people to be friends, they're a trinity of great people.
Mm-hmm. I'm also always gonna be mad at Konami for doing that.
Yes, it's frustrating.
It's painful, is what it is.
But yeah, so that's all I had on Junji Ito. We can give our final thoughts. Adrian and Matt, you can go first.
I mean, as most horror stuff we do, I'll probably never read this, but I know a bunch of people who will. So I'm excited to kind of like recommend this to some of my friends who might not be familiar with him, but are still like really big into like horror and stuff. So I'm hoping that it becomes bigger so Stefani can have someone to watch this stuff with, because given these pictures, I mean, the chair, I think I can do the chair. I'm all right with that one. But the one about the dude aging, probably not. I don't like that. I don't like that one. And then the girl with like the half face, I don't like that picture either. But it's cool. It's cool that it's getting bigger over here. I think that Hot Topic line, I think, is a really big indicator. I mean, not that like getting these web series and stuff isn't, but I mean, if people are selling out their clothing line at Hot Topic in this day and age where people don't like to go to the malls and stuff, I think that's really, really cool. I just hope it gets bigger so people like Kate and Sid can kind of have that here in the U.S., not have to wait forever for translations to come out. And I think Del Toro would make a great movie of some of this, because I think he would kill it to bring this stuff to life.
I mean, the fact that they're besties is why I would be okay with it.
Yeah, let's do it.
I want it.
Let's do an under one. Give him BioShock. Give him some of those fishy people who want to come back and kill everybody. I think that'd be dope. There you go. Give it to me.
Matt?
Yeah, I'm like with Adrian. I'm probably never going to check this out. I don't read manga or care for horror that much. So, nah, but I did learn a lot. Obviously, I'm with Adrian also of like, I don't see why some of the chair stuff is that frightening. Seems very logical and not rational for a lot of the thinking here. But I mean, I guess it's horror and people freak out and they like it. So, I mean, that's fun. There's nobody lives in our attic. I'm pretty sure the dog would have told us already.
That you know of. Danny DeVito's up there right now.
Yeah.
Ready to come out of a chair.
See, the thing is, you're like, somebody lives in our attic, they would be dead. Nobody could live up there.
It's hot today.
But you know, I mean, cool. I guess it's coming to the West, like a lot of things seem to be, as we talk about, and it's still growing. So we'll see where it goes.
Quick, if it came out and said Del Toro was working with Junji to adapt one of the things into a movie, which one do you pick?
Ooh. I think Del Toro would kill Uzumaki.
Yeah, I was about to say that. I think that would be his brand very much.
It's entirely his brand. Creepy town, crazy visuals.
Yeah, and like the fantastical
I guess my final thoughts. I mean, this entire episode is really just my giant love letter to Junji Ito because I love him. I love what he's done for manga, for visuals, and for all the people that I know who love him, especially in the horror community. And I hope more people start reading him now that it's becoming more accessible. I definitely think everybody should pick up Shiver from Viz Media, and that's available in bookstores and everything. Or online because Corona, but you can find that there. They also just released the Junji Ito collection today, which is a giant art book. So if you just want to look at really scary things, pick that up too, and come talk with me about it because I love him. Cidnya, what are your final thoughts?
I'm in the same boat. I never really ever get to talk about Junji Ito in a big space or with someone who like knows him as well. I think the only other person is one of my best friends, Kelly. She got me one piece of the Junji Ito collection, but she was the person who showed me it in high school. She was like, "Why do they have this in our high school library?" And I was like, "I don't know. This is really weird. I'm very confused, but I love it." And for years, she's been one of the only people that I've ever talked to about Junji Ito. So to have you, Kate, invite me on and talk about, his history and his publications and like how like his works like affect you and like where we can have that kind of like bonding over like very strange niche anxieties. It's fun, and I really hope that the horror community will embrace him as he starts to rise. I think once Toonami has their anime adaptation up, I think so many people are going to flock to him, and I'm very excited to see that happen, just to have more friends where I can be like, "Oh my god, yes, someone else gets it. You're one of us."
The doors are always open at the Church of Junji Ito. That's all I will say. It's kind of creepy in here, but we can all be in it together. But yeah, Cidnya, why don't you, one, thank you for coming on and talking with us. Two, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say thank you. That's all for coming on.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad I'm here. I had a lot of fun.
Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you on the internets? Don't forget to plug your booktube.
I am everywhere on YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter at Cidnya Reads, and that is CIDNYA Reads. And yeah, I'm on there a lot. I yell on Twitter. I post cool book pictures, and yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Cool. Well, as always, if you want to help support the show a little bit more, head on over to patreon.com/butwhythopc. Also, you can find us on TeePublic. Us and the site are now TeePublic partners, so you can go pick up some But Why Though merch and really help us out that way if a monthly subscription is too much, which we get it. It's a lot. Or just keep showing us love on social media at But Why Though PC on Twitter, Instagram, and all of the things. And you can find me on Twitter at OhMyMythRandier. Adrian?
Yep, you can find me on Twitter at SuperRuiz93, SuperRuiz 93.
Matt?
I guess I'm just going to go rip my chair apart and see what happens.
Oh.